This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance. I guarantee you that the title of this video really isn't misleading. I have indeed got a PC motherboard that uses literally exactly the same silicon as Xbox One, and yes, after a long and drawn out process I have managed to run Cyberpunk 2077 on it. But the whole story of how this came about is rather strange. Put simply, word emerged last year of a hitherto unheard of AMD APU dubbed the A9-9820. Chinese OEM Chewy marketed a product called the Aerobox around it, and word started to emerge that this wasn't actually a new chip at all, but rather a refactored Xbox One processor. Late last year, this board started to emerge in Chinese markets, and I, along with other creators, well, we had to buy one, right? Why? Well, I was intrigued. The octo-core AMD Jaguar setup used by all of the Microsoft and Sony last-gen consoles was never made available in the PC space. We never quite got to grips with how good, or indeed how bad, this particular Jaguar configuration was. And me being me, I had to know. Yes, I wanted to benchmark it, but I actually really wanted to play games on it. And why not something really challenging? Why not Cyberpunk 2077? After all, it may have issues, but it is playable on this silicon within the Xbox One console. So began a journey that so far has lasted a couple of months, only now coming to any kind of conclusion. Let's quickly talk about the board, starting with the processor itself. It is indeed the Xbox One chip, there's no doubt about it, which opens up a whole new debate about how this all actually happened. It's dubbed the A9-9820 or RX8120, depending on the BIOS configuration. It's clearly being sold by AMD, yet I would assume that Microsoft owns the design, which makes its appearance here on a PC product a bit odd, to say the least. Regardless, reports that it's the revised 16nm chip found in the Xbox One S are unfounded. Put both chip versions side by side with the new board, and it's clearly the 28nm Durango original, which presumably went out of production sort of back in 2016. Now it's emerged again 4 years later for some reason. It's just weird. Beyond that, the board strips out the integrated DDR3 modules used on Xbox One, replacing them with 4 DIMM slots instead. Xbox One only had need for 2 SATA ports for storage and a disk drive, but this board goes further with 4 in total, along with, remarkably, an NVMe slot and a Gen 2 PCIe X1 slot. There are also 2 USB 3s, 4 USB 2s, keyboard and mouse PS2, HDMI output, audio outputs and Ethernet. The board also comes with a heatsink and fan, but curiously the board mounts look set up for mainstream Intel coolers. Booting up the board proved challenging. It really is quite unstable. And when you do get access, the BIOS is in turn simplistic or overly verbose, and it's not actually clear if most of the functions actually work. What seems obvious is that memory support is limited. It booted with the 4 Corsair Vengeance 2133MHz DDR3 sticks I acquired specifically for this testing, and I purchased those because Xbox One uses 2133MHz RAM. It's the obvious fit, but this board would only run them at 1333MHz. Options suggest up to 1866MHz support, but I couldn't get it to work, and this is problematic for testing the onboard graphics, which is the same GPU found in Xbox One. The console is already a bandwidth-constrained design. It has access to peak bandwidth of 68GB per second, but I could only muster around 14GB per second from this board, just 21% of the console's throughput, suggesting that Xbox's quad-channel memory controllers possibly aren't being fully used. There's also no access to the 32 megs of ESRAM, of course, while graphics memory is limited to 512 megs or 2GB depending on your BIOS. This level of bandwidth makes testing the integrated graphics a worthless endeavour, particularly as the only driver for this board hails from 2017. But for non-graphics applications at least, we can divert all of that bandwidth to the CPU and to test that. But gaming to any meaningful degree will prove challenging. Regardless, there's still some fun to be had here. Within the BIOS, adjusting for a lower power state turns the CPU into an RX 8120, which sounds like something a lot more modern than it really is. We're on Jaguar here, trust me. Simply clocks the chip down to 1.75 GHz, which, curiously enough, is the same as the base Xbox One. Adjusting to a higher power state increases clocks to 2.35 GHz. Funnily enough, similar to Xbox One X, where the CPU rebrands itself as the A9-9820. I don't have particular interest in synthetic benchmarks, but it's obviously very slow. So check out Cinebench here. We've stacked up this chip against the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600. Yes, the last gen console CPUs have around 23% lower IPC than a stock Q6600, but it does gain ground because it has twice as many physical cores, and yet I'd still bet that an overclock on Intel's Classic could bring it up to par or move ahead. Also sobering is that a modern chip like the Zen 2 based Ryzen 7 3700X achieves around 4700 points in Cinebench R20 and around 2100 in R15. So yes, these Jaguar cores are stupendously slow. They weren't very fast even when they were new, and right from the off, I prostrate myself before the talented developers who have achieved so much from them across the entirety of the last console generation. But can we run games on this thing, PC games? Can we get any idea of how 8 very low performance cores operate on modern PC titles? Well, the BIOS allows users to disable the integrated graphics, suggesting that a PCI Express GPU can be added, and I started by using a PCI Express X1 to X16 adapter typically used by crypto miners on specialist mining specific motherboards. Remarkably, it worked with no problem whatsoever, and I started testing with an RTX 2060, and yes, I could load up Cyberpunk 2077 and play it. However, was the expectedly poor performance because of the CPU, or was it down to the piffling 395 megabytes per second of PCIe Express bandwidth I had there? If the CPU can't feed the GPU, this will present as a CPU limitation, even when it's the interface that's at fault, and man, this interface is clearly very tight. I made 2 breakthroughs in getting games to actually run at what I think is the actual limit of the CPU, and it started by taking a look at the weird NVMe interface on the board, which is essentially a PCI Express socket refactored. It took some weeks to arrive from China, but I ordered an NVMe to PCIe X16 adapter, and astonishingly, it worked. Now, this isn't a full NVMe implementation as such, but my bandwidth to the GPU doubled to 795 megabytes per second. Then I could use the monitoring and benchmarking tool CapFrameX to measure PCIe bandwidth on a normal PC to check that this limit was not being exceeded on my Jaguar PC, but this is an imprecise test at best, and PCIe limitations may still have some bearing on results. The second breakthrough? Swapping out the RTX 2060 for a Radeon 6800 XT. In-game performance improved visibly, even at super low resolutions. I suspect this may well be down to driver efficiency, but the bottom line is that Doom Eternal suddenly started to run at 50 to 90 frames per second, where previously it struggled to top out beyond 45 frames per second on the RTX card. Clearly some kind of bottleneck has been removed there then. And yes, you heard that correctly. Using the high settings, which are broadly equivalent to Xbox One X, the board in A9-9820 mode at 2.35 GHz, when paired with an external GPU, could play the game just fine, almost as well as an actual last-gen console. Testament to the amount of effort id Software put into extracting maximum CPU performance from its new id Tech 7 engine. Only very large open environments seem to cause drops beneath 60 FPS, but this is a remarkable state of affairs for a processor that a relatively highly clocked Q6600 could match and probably exceed, and which would be monstered by any of the modern day Intel Core architectures, and I suspect even the very first one. All of which brings us to the mighty challenge of Cyberpunk 2077, and the reasons for choosing this one are obvious. It's a highly controversial gaming release, it runs poorly on last-gen consoles, and conventional wisdom suggests that the game is simply too complex to run on Jaguar class CPUs. The PC version's minimum CPU spec is a vintage 2012 Core i5-3570K type of quad-core Intel chip that dominated for many years, or else the AMD FX8310, an octo-core processor from 2014. Both are vastly improved over the performance offered up by the Xbox One CPU, so one might expect a bloodbath, and let's be clear, it's not great. However, the results I did get are certainly interesting and not quite the low FPS slideshow you might have expected, for the most part at least. Now, in order to match Xbox One X to our PC here, I used the quality level equals console pro launch argument that should in theory set up Cyberpunk 2077 with graphics presets in line with Xbox One X, tweaking where necessary. I added back in post-processing that I know the console uses, I dialed back the crowd density I know it doesn't, and I also invoked the slow storage option. However, I did run the game from SSD, and in order to match it up against Xbox One X, I captured the console version running from solid state storage too. I'm using a 30 FPS cap here on the PC to match Xbox, but what this means is that in both cases we don't really have any idea on CPU overhead beyond 30 frames per second. But introducing a cap definitely helps to give the CPU a bit of breathing room on PC, and this can help with game consistency. On the GPU side, I'm on close to console equivalent settings, but because the 6800 XT is such a monster, I'm just going to run it flat out at native 4K. Xbox One X, by comparison, requires dynamic resolution scaling. But as you can see in the early stages of Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm choosing the Nomad path here, there's a surprising amount of plain sailing. I do think that background streaming can cause some problems, but it's interesting how close to Xbox One X performance we are pretty much across the board. Also interesting, I'm using Cyberpunk's inbuilt 30 FPS cap on PC, and curiously it provides proper frame pacing when many PC games with a 30 FPS cap do not. Going back to the CPU though, it is worth stressing that while we are running PC code on a console APU, the way it's being run and processed is quite different. The consoles have specific reservations of about 1.5 CPU cores for running the OS and the front-end menus, while the PC can tap into all 8 cores. Now, Windows 10 is likely to be highly inefficient in comparison to its console counterpart, but it's unlikely to be sucking up 1.5 cores worth of performance all of the time. So on paper, our Jaguar PC may possibly have more overall performance than the consoles. On the flip side, consoles offer more direct programming and have far more efficient APIs. The DX12 and Vulkan drivers delivered by AMD look great, bearing in mind what I'm asking from them on this PC. But it's likely that the consoles are even more efficient. Not only that, but they also have unified memory. We're going to be paying a cost here in terms of uploading all of that data from system memory to GPU VRAM on the CPU side. I'd also expect storage APIs to be much improved on the console side, bearing in mind how much performance we're getting there from very low spec laptop hard drives. As we progress through our Xbox One versus Jaguar PC testing, streaming does seem to be a challenge for both of our systems, but more so on PC, despite running the same CPU and similar storage. However, I don't think we are GPU limited at any point on the PC side, but we may well be at points on Xbox One X. Consider this chase sequence. There are minor dips on Xbox which we don't see at all on PC, and they do seem to be tied into explosions on screen. These can be very impactful on the Xbox GPU, but on the PC side, relatively speaking, we have a bottomless pit of performance from that super powerful RX 6800 XT. Across this sequence, our Jaguar-powered PC is therefore more stable, but things do change up pretty quickly as we move into Cyberpunk's quick-cut intro sequence. At this point, both Xbox and Jaguar PC struggle, but Xbox is ahead. Both systems dropping at the same point, with the same scenarios if you like. This does suggest a CPU bottleneck, though as the cutscene continues, there are areas where the PC maintains 30 FPS where the Xbox One X does not. Moving into another driving sequence though, with matched content, relatively slow traversal through the city causes no problem for either of our systems here, but as combat kicks in, both drop frames. This suggests both are CPU limited, but again, Xbox is pretty much always ahead. Remember, we don't have unified memory on the PC side, while it's unclear how much memory bandwidth the CPU has on consoles. If it's significantly higher than what we've got on PC here, it will make a difference. But it's the city and traversal that really is taxing, as we know. This simple walkabout suggests that Xbox is again more consistent, but PC is surprisingly close all things considered. Remaining in the same area and letting the cutscene with Jackie play out, remember we are still in the city there, sees both systems tied to 30 FPS, but once we get into the car and make our way to visit the Ripper Dock, well, background streaming is poor on Xbox One X clearly, but obviously far worse on PC. Another interesting test is this cutscene / dialogue with Dex. We're still running the entire city and the streaming systems in the background, and while initially it seems that we are equally CPU limited on both systems, again Xbox is more stable overall as the conversation fully plays out. I do wonder whether PCI Express bandwidth limitations may be having some effect here, but cutting to combat, well, it's a dog's dinner on both systems, but again Xbox has a small lead in consistency overall. Streaming does seem to be the nemesis of Cyberpunk on Jaguar generally. Check out this dash through the packed streets. Really bad on Xbox, but it's totally abysmal on our Jaguar-powered PC. It's at this point that I will remind you that on both systems, a cutting-edge game like Cyberpunk 2077 is being run on what is effectively mediocre 2007-2008 levels of PC CPU performance. It's a miracle it's running at all. A final word on traversal. Here's something quite interesting. There are areas where Xbox One X seems to work just fine, and well, slight instability apart, it's the same on our Jaguar PC, so there's clearly a differential there. But the same scenarios are causing problems for both of the systems. PC seems to have a harder time overall though. And just to reiterate, we don't have unified RAM there, we don't know how much memory bandwidth the consoles have in relation to our PC setup, plus the consoles do benefit from those much more streamlined APIs, and with all of that in mind, I'm surprised at just how close our PC actually gets. So what's the takeaway from what is largely academic testing? Well, I've always wanted to get direct access to the CPU within the last gen consoles because 8-core Jaguar CPUs were never made for anything other than games machines for consoles. There was no PC equivalent part until this board appeared. AMD itself did foist Jaguar upon us, but only as a quad-core chip in the PC space, and it was barely adequate when it launched, and it's absolutely lousy judged by today's standard. Think of it as a competitor to the vintage Intel Atoms from back in the day. By going wide and putting two of these core complexes together, AMD, Microsoft and Sony delivered an area-efficient, low-power design that was effectively the only viable choice available to them in creating the all-in-one APUs that were in the last-gen machines. Since then, developers have had to work with what they had, and based on the raw horsepower they were given compared to the CPUs of the time, it can't have been an easy ride. I was particularly impressed with the results from Doom Eternal, where the Jaguar CPU cluster could power an RX 6800 XT to 4K 60, delivering a mostly smooth experience. I'm actually showing you footage here of the game running unlocked with all of the performance metrics enabled, so you can get an idea of how everything runs here tapped out. We've seen this title perform beautifully as a high frame rate experience on modern PC hardware, but achieving that was delivered mostly through a threading design which exploits as many cores as possible. It's a nice thing to have in the modern many-core PC CPU era, but it's absolutely essential in pumping that much performance through the Jaguar processors in the last-gen consoles. As for Cyberpunk 2077, clearly the results were not so impressive, but the fact that a processor with mediocre 2007 class CPU performance is able to run the game at all, quite astonishing in my opinion. My overall impression was that the lashed up Jaguar powered PC was obviously struggling and often in the same scenarios as Xbox One. but it did perform worse overall. We can mostly rule out the storage as the problem, as fast traversal through the city or running through denser areas causes issues on both of the systems I tested. Streaming and decompression of data is clearly a challenge, but the engine itself, the Red engine, it's clearly not suboptimal. On PC and definitely on Xbox One, I'd say, it's soaking all available cores and getting as much out of them as possible, and it is leveraging those console-specific low-level APIs. It's just that the sheer amount being asked of the CPU, arguably it's just too much. And how CDPR aim to get more out of Jaguar with its upcoming patches for Cyberpunk to improve performance there remains to be seen. What seems clear to me is that to get Cyberpunk 2077 into the state it's in even now looks to have been a Herculean task, as the scale of the ambition in this game, as we've said in the past, it's clearly next generation in nature. As for this bizarre motherboard, it's a curious artifact for sure, but the maker claims Core i5 7400 levels of performance, which I would fundamentally disagree with. This board, it's just not recommended in any way whatsoever, but it is an interesting mixture of technological curiosity and calamity, and also a valuable historical artifact. I enjoyed toying with it, getting the measure of this unique implementation of a CPU originally designed for low-power laptops and even tablets. But the one lasting impression I have is of an underperforming component from which developers have delivered miracles across the last console generation. So that's all I have for you now. I've enjoyed this project, it's taken a long time to deliver, and it's only really possible because we have some excellent backing from our Patreon supporters. So do consider joining that, where you'll get high quality ad-free versions of our video and access to the DF Discord. Meanwhile, liking, subscribing, sharing, it's all good. Bell ringing, of course, for instant notification when new content appears. It's the way forward. But in the meantime, have a think about anything else you'd like to see from this bizarre Xbox One based PC. Should we maybe benchmark this chip like we would any other gaming CPU? Or should we do something else with it? Or maybe we should just retire it altogether in the way that Microsoft and Sony have. I'll leave that for you to consider, but in the here and now, thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did. And of course, just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry. A gaming icon evolved. Logitech's renowned G502 mouse joins the ranks of the world's most advanced gaming mice with the release of the G502 Lightspeed, featuring ultra-fast wireless connectivity and reliability with performance trusted in competition by esports pros. Featuring the next generation Hero 25K sensor and PowerPlay compatibility, this is the ultimate rendition of the celebrated G502 mouse.